There's a moment I've replayed in my mind probably 10,000 times. I'm standing at a podium in a university auditorium, the kind with those old wooden seats that creak every time someone shifts their weight, and the lights above the stage are just slightly too bright, the kind that make everything feel exposed. I can smell the chalk dust and old paper that seems to live permanently inside academic buildings, that specific smell of accumulated knowledge and accumulated argument, and I can feel the familiar warmth of absolute certainty running through my chest like something solid. I've done this before. I've done this dozens of times. I know how this ends. I know how it always ends. And then a man across the stage says something so simple, so devastatingly quiet, that the certainty I'd carried for 30 years begins to fracture. Not with a crash, not with thunder, but with the softest sound imaginable, like ice, barely, beginning to give. My name is Thomas Hartwell. I was a professor of philosophy and religious studies at a mid-sized university in Ohio for 26 years. I held 2 doctorates. I had published 4 books, the most well-known of which carried a title that, looking back now, tells you everything you need to know about who I was. The God Delusion and the Minds That Need It. I was not Richard Dawkins. I was not Christopher Hitchens. But in my circles, in my world, I was known. I was the man you called when you wanted someone to walk into a room full of believers and walk out having dismantled everything they thought they knew. And I was good at it. I was very, very good at it. I had spent the better part of my adult life getting good at it. And the tragedy that I couldn't see at the time was that I had confused being good at something with that something being worth doing. If you're watching this and this is your first time here, I just want to ask you quickly, please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like if something in what I'm saying is already touching something in you. These testimonies exist because someone believed they were worth sharing, and every single subscriber tells the people behind this work that it matters. I believe yours might be next. I wasn't raised in a vacuum. I want you to understand that. I wasn't some cold machine assembled in a laboratory and pointed at religion like a weapon. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of town where the church and the diner and the hardware store are all within walking distance of each other, and everyone knows your family's name and your grandmother's maiden name and the story of how your parents met. My mother was a Methodist, a sincere one, not a performative one, not the kind who needed religion to be seen doing religion. She had a worn Bible on her nightstand, the cover gone soft with years of handling, the pages marked with small penciled notes in her neat slanted handwriting, notes in the margins that I would only read years later, after she was gone, and that would undo me completely. I remember watching her pray sometimes, early in the mornings before the house woke up, kneeling beside her bed with her hands folded and her lips moving almost soundlessly. And even as a child I felt something complicated watching that. Not contempt. Not yet. Something more like longing mixed with confusion. Like watching someone speak a language you couldn't quite catch, and not being sure whether you wanted to learn it or whether you wanted to prove it wasn't a real language at all. My father was different. My father was a quiet, methodical man who worked as an engineer and believed in what he could measure and what he could verify. He wasn't hostile to my mother's faith. He simply lived beside it like a man living beside a river he had no particular interest in crossing. He came to church on Christmas and Easter. He bowed his head at the dinner table when my mother prayed, but his eyes were always somewhere else, focused on some interior calculation, some problem he was working through, some structure he was building in his mind. And I, being my father's son in so many ways that I've spent a lifetime cataloging, began drifting in his direction long before I had the vocabulary to name what I was doing. By the time I was 14, I had decided, with the absolute confidence that only a 14-year-old can manufacture from reading 3 books, that God was a story. A useful one maybe, a comforting one certainly, but a story nonetheless. Something human beings had invented to cope with the terrifying silence of a universe that didn't care about them. I had read enough to feel dangerous. A little Nietzsche, some Bertrand Russell, a dog-eared copy of The Age of Reason that I'd found in a second-hand bookshop for 75 cents, the pages yellowed, and smelling of someone else's old house. I underlined passages with a red pen and felt the specific pleasure of someone who believes he has found a secret the rest of the world is too afraid to look at. I was, in the terminology I would eventually learn to apply, in the early and most intoxicating stages of intellectual pride. I just didn't know it yet. By college, I had sharpened this into something harder. I studied philosophy at a state university where I found professors who sharpened my skepticism into something almost surgical, then went on to a doctoral program where I found my people, brilliant, skeptical, articulate people who saw the dismantling of religious thought as something close to a moral duty. We believed we were doing humanity a favor. We believed that faith was not just intellectually indefensible, but genuinely harmful, a mechanism of control, a way of keeping people small and afraid and manageable, a system designed by those with power to maintain that power over those without it. And I built my career on that belief with the kind of dedication that I see now can only really be called devotion. The irony of that word didn't occur to me for a very long time. The debates began almost by accident. A colleague invited me to speak at a campus event responding to a visiting Christian apologist, and I went in expecting nothing, and came out having dismantled the man so thoroughly that afterward several students told me it was the most exhilarating thing they'd ever witnessed in an academic setting. I didn't feel pride exactly. I felt something colder and more satisfying than pride. I felt correct, and that feeling became a kind of addiction. The very kind of thing I spent my professional life explaining that religious experience was. I was medicating something with certainty, the same way I claimed believers were medicating something with faith. I simply couldn't see it yet. Over the following 30 years, I debated Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, New Age thinkers, theologians, pastors, priests, and every variety of lay believer who had the nerve to step onto a stage with me. I traveled to conferences in Boston and Chicago and London, and once, memorably, to a small college in rural Georgia, where the auditorium smelled of pine and old wood, and the audience sat with folded arms and narrowed eyes, and I still won. I had a methodology, I had a repertoire. I knew which arguments would land and which would make an audience laugh nervously and which would leave an opponent stuttering at the microphone. I was not cruel. I want to be clear about that, or at least I was not intentionally cruel. I was precise. I was surgical. I dismantled ideas, not people. At least that's what I told myself. I told myself this with great regularity and with the fluency of someone who has practiced a self-narrative until it feels like truth. What I didn't tell myself, what I was very careful never to examine too closely, was that I had begun to need these debates the way some people need a drink. The certainty I performed on stage had started to feel different off stage, quieter, more brittle, like a cast that holds something together but also prevents healing. There were nights, and I won't pretend otherwise, when I would lie in bed in the particular silence of a house where no one was waiting for you, where no one had been waiting for you for years, and I would feel the universe's indifference not as a philosophical position, but as a physical sensation, cold and absolute, pressing in from every direction, filling every corner of every room. And on those nights, I would think about my mother kneeling beside her bed in the grey morning light, lips moving, hands folded, her face arranged in something that looked remarkably like peace, and I would feel something I refused to name. I was very practiced at refusing to name it. My marriage had ended 11 years before the debate that changed everything. Ellen had been a patient woman, patient beyond what I deserved, and she had tried for 17 years to reach something in me that I kept locked behind what I called rationality, and what she, I eventually understood, called a wall. She was a painter. She saw the world in color and texture and light in a way that I found beautiful in the abstract and threatening in practice, because beauty had always made me uncomfortable. It seemed to point to something I didn't want to follow where it led. When she left, she said something I never forgot. She said, "Thomas, you've spent your whole life proving that nothing is sacred, and now nothing is." I told her that was a logical fallacy dressed up as emotion. I had my response ready before she finished the sentence. She looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at something you're saying goodbye to for the last time, and then she picked up her bags and walked out into a grey November afternoon, and the door closed with a sound that somehow had too much finality in it for how softly it shut. I stood in the hallway for a long time after that, in the smell of her perfume that still hung in the air, and then I went to my desk and opened a paper. I was writing about the problem of religious epistemology, and I did not stop working until almost 3 in the morning. After Ellen, there was work. There was always work. Students, lectures, papers, debates, conferences. I moved through years the way you move through water. Not swimming exactly, not drowning, just moving. Displaced by nothing, displacing nothing. My daughter, Caitlin, still called on birthdays and at Christmas, and we would talk for 20 or 30 minutes with the careful politeness of people who love each other and cannot reach each other and have stopped trying quite as hard as they once did. There was a careful distance in her voice that I recognized as self-protection, and I recognized it because I had put it there. I had not been a present father. I had been a correct one, which is not the same thing at all. I had taught her to think clearly and to argue precisely and to distrust what she could not demonstrate, and in doing so, I had given her a set of tools and taken away something she would have to find on her own, much later, in ways I could not have predicted. I want to stop here for just a second and ask you something real. Where are you watching this from right now? What city? What country? I ask, because I genuinely believe that whatever brought you here today, whatever search you typed at midnight, whatever link someone sent you, whatever quiet and restless evening led you to press play, it was not an accident. I know what it feels like to be surrounded by people and still feel completely, utterly alone, to be the most articulate person in any room and still have no language for the thing you actually feel. If that's where you are right now, I want you to know that this story doesn't end in loneliness. I promise it doesn't. Keep listening. The debate was scheduled for a Friday evening in March, in the university's largest lecture hall, which seated about 400 people and which smelled on that particular evening of coffee from the reception table outside and of the coal that people had brought in on their coats from the parking lot. It was that particular kind of Midwestern March cold, sharp and persistent, the kind that makes the interior warmth of a building feel like something earned. My opponent was a man named James Calloway. He was, I was told, a pastor from a small evangelical church in rural Kentucky, which told me almost everything I thought I needed to know. He had a master's degree in theology from a seminary I'd never heard of, and had published a single thin book of sermons that had sold, according to the brief bio I was given, several thousand copies. He was not a professional debater. He was not a philosopher. He had no publications in peer-reviewed journals. He was, by any measure I used at the time, outclassed before he opened his mouth. I remember thinking, settling into the backstage area with my notes and my coffee, that this would be one of the easier ones. The topic was the one I had argued so many times I could have delivered both sides in my sleep. Does God exist? A rational inquiry. Standard framework, opening statements, rebuttals, cross-examination, closing. I arrived early, arranged my notes. I still wrote on paper then, yellow legal pads covered in my cramped academic handwriting. Drank the slightly stale, slightly burnt coffee that always appeared backstage at these events as if by institutional law, and waited with the calm of someone who has done this enough times that the nerves have been replaced by something almost like boredom. Almost. There was still something I felt before every debate, a low-grade sharpening, a narrowing of attention that I had always attributed to professional instinct. Looking back now, I wonder if part of it was something else, a kind of hunger. James Calloway arrived with a worn leather Bible that had clearly been carried for years, the spine creased and soft, a notepad, and a smile that struck me immediately as strange because it wasn't nervous. People who debate me are nervous. It's one of the things I'd come to count on, the way you count on weather patterns. Their nervousness is useful. It makes them reach for their prepared arguments too quickly, clip their own best points, stumble into my territory before they've established their own. But Calloway wasn't nervous. He was, and this is the word that occurred to me at the time, though I immediately tried to set it aside, settled. He shook my hand with a firm, dry grip, looked me directly in the eyes with a steadiness that most academics couldn't maintain for more than a few seconds, and said, "Thank you for having this conversation, Professor. I've read your work." Something about the way he said it, not deferentially, not combatively, not performatively, just simply as a statement of fact, made me recalibrate slightly, just slightly, the smallest adjustment of an instrument. The first 40 minutes went exactly as I expected. I laid out the cosmological argument's logical weaknesses with the fluency of someone who has done it dozens of times, addressed the fine-tuning argument with practiced efficiency, moved through the problem of evil with the kind of quiet devastation that I knew from experience would unsettle a believer deeply. The specific unease of someone watching the intellectual foundations of something precious being carefully, methodically removed. The audience, which was mostly students and faculty, leaned forward the way they always did. That particular attention that gathers around a performance of precision. Calloway responded thoughtfully, genuinely better than I'd expected, better than his credentials would have suggested, but still within the parameters of arguments I'd heard and answered 100 times, in 100 auditoriums, in front of 100 audiences that looked more or less like this one. And then came the moment. It wasn't during the formal debate structure. It was in the cross-examination portion when I was asking him the questions I always asked, the ones I had refined over years, the ones designed not to humiliate but to expose the logical gap at the center of any faith position, the place where evidence ends and something else begins, and where I had always been able to drive a very precise and effective wedge. I asked him, "Mr. Calloway, can you describe for this audience one single moment in your personal experience that you would offer as genuine evidence, not emotional sensation, not confirmation bias, not the ordinary human tendency to find pattern in noise, but actual evidence of the existence of God?" I expected the usual. A personal story, emotionally freighted, intellectually soft. Something about a moment of prayer, or a feeling in a church, or a coincidence that had seemed too perfectly timed to be random. Something I could engage with gently, acknowledge the human reality of it, and then dismantle cleanly, in a way that would feel respectful to the audience and devastating to the argument. I had done this so many times that I almost knew the shape of the answer before he gave it. What I got was something else entirely. He was quiet for a moment, not a fumbling quiet. Not a searching quiet, not the quiet of someone casting around for an answer. A considered quiet, a deliberate one. The quiet of someone making a choice about what to say, rather than trying to remember what they'd prepared. And then he looked at me. Not at the audience, not at his notes, at me, directly, with the kind of eye contact that most people break within seconds. And he said, "Professor Hartwell, I don't think you actually want me to answer that question." The room shifted. I felt it physically. A change in the air pressure of that space, a collective intake of breath that became a collective stillness. 400 people going quiet at the same moment feels like something. It has a weight to it. I said, "I assure you, Mr. Calloway, I am genuinely asking." And he said, still looking directly at me, still with that unnerving, unbroken calm, "I know you are. But here's what I've noticed, having read your work carefully and listened to you tonight. You have spent 30 years asking believers to defend their experience of God. You've built an entire career on that question. You've asked it in auditoriums and lecture halls and books and articles, and every time someone has tried to answer you, you've had a response ready before they finished. And in all of that time, with all of those people, I don't think anyone has ever turned the question around and asked you what you're actually afraid of finding." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had ever heard in my life. Louder than any applause, louder than any argument. I opened my mouth. I had a response. I always have a response. That is the thing I had built myself around, the thing I was most certain about myself, that I would always have a response. But for a fraction of a second, one fraction, one pause that probably lasted less than 2 heartbeats, the response didn't come. And in that fraction, something happened that I cannot explain rationally and have long since stopped trying to. It felt like a door, not opening, just becoming visible. A door I had wallpapered over so carefully for so many years, with so many layers of argument and publication and performance and certainty, that I had genuinely forgotten it was there. And in that fraction of a second, I could feel the draft coming from underneath it, cold and real and unmistakable. I recovered. I gave a polished, practiced answer about the category error of projecting psychological states onto epistemological questions, about the difference between what a person fears and what is true, about the rhetorical technique of redirecting an evidence question into an emotional one. The audience nodded. The debate continued. I won by every measurable standard. The applause at the end was longer for me. The students who came up afterwards said what students always said, and I signed a copy of my book for someone and shook hands with the event organizer and said the things you say after these events. And then I drove home alone through the Ohio dark, the highway mostly empty, the radio off. And I pulled into my driveway, and I sat in the car for 45 minutes without turning off the engine, and the heater ran, and the dashboard lights glowed faintly, and I could not tell you what I was thinking, because I don't think I was thinking at all. I was feeling something in the specific place where I never allowed myself to feel things, and I did not have a category for it. The weeks after the debate were strange in a way I didn't share with anyone, because I didn't have anyone to share strange things with, which was itself something I preferred not to examine. I continued teaching. I met my classes, held my office hours, attended faculty meetings that lasted too long and resolved too little, ate lunch alone in my office the way I usually did, reading. But something had loosened in the architecture of how I moved through days. A question had gotten in, through a crack I thought I had sealed, and it would not be dislodged. Not Calloway's question exactly, but the one it had pointed to, like a finger pointing at something I had been very carefully not looking at. What was I afraid of finding? I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I had been tired that night, that I had needed more sleep, that the question had only landed the way it had because Calloway had been more rhetorically skilled than I'd anticipated and had found a gap in my presentation rather than a gap in my reasoning. I told myself this with the same fluency I used to tell first-year students that their intuitions about consciousness were based on category errors. I was good at it. I had been telling myself reassuring rational things for decades, and I was as good at it as I was at anything. But telling yourself something and believing it have a way of separating, quietly, incrementally, when you're not paying close enough attention. And I had been paying attention to everything except that. I started doing something I hadn't done in decades. I started reading theology, not to refute it, just to read it. I told myself it was research. I told myself I was preparing a comprehensive response to the rhetorical technique Calloway had used, something I might publish, something useful. I stayed late in my office some nights, the lamp making a warm yellow circle on my desk while the rest of the university settled into nighttime quiet. The building emptying around me, the hallways going dark one by one, and I read Augustine's Confessions, which I had assigned to students for 20 years without ever really reading, and I read Aquinas and Pascal and Kierkegaard, whose anguish felt uncomfortably recognizable, and C.S. Lewis, whom I had dismissed for years as too popular to be serious, too accessible to be rigorous, and who now kept saying things that sat in my chest like stones that wouldn't dissolve. I read Lewis's description of his own atheism. That comfortable feeling of being the one in charge, of having closed the universe neatly and tidily, of the door being shut and the room being one's own. And I recognized it so completely, with such specific and physical recognition, that I had to set the book down and walk to the window and stand there looking out at the empty campus for a long time, at the pools of light from the lampposts and the dark shapes of the trees against the sky. 3 months after the debate, I called James Calloway. I had his number from the event organizers, saved in my phone under his name with a note next to it that said, simply, Kentucky Pastor, as though that told me everything. I told myself I was calling to ask a follow-up question for a paper I was writing. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear something in the background immediately. Children's voices, more than one. Someone laughing, something that sounded like a door opening onto an outdoor space, the general warm noise of a house that was full of people and life and the ordinary chaos of a family. He said, Professor Hartwell, I wondered if I might hear from you. I said, that thing you said, in the debate. about what I was afraid of finding. He waited. He had a gift for waiting, for not filling silence with words, which is rarer than it sounds, especially among people who are good with words. I said, "I've been thinking about it." He said, "I know. I've been praying for you." Something about those 5 words hit me in a way that I cannot fully articulate even now, years later, not condescendingly, not as a performance of piety, not as a rhetorical move, just as simple information, delivered with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting the weather. "I've been praying for you," as if it were the most natural thing in the world to spend time in conversation with an invisible God on behalf of a man who had spent his career explaining in print and in public why invisible gods were a human invention. I felt, and this is the honest truth, and honesty is all I have to offer, I felt something like being seen, which was a strange thing to feel from a man I had met once, for a few hours, across a debate podium. We talked for 2 hours that first call. He didn't argue with me. He didn't try to win anything. He didn't quote scripture at me or challenge my positions or ask me to defend my published work. He asked me questions, real questions, and listened to the answers, the way very few people in my life had ever listened to me. Not waiting for their turn to talk, not preparing a response, just actually receiving what I said and sitting with it before speaking. At the end of the call he said, "Thomas, can I call you Thomas?" And I said yes. And he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as one human being to another, not as a debater or a pastor or anything positioned above or below anything else. I think you already know that there's something true on the other side of that door. I think you've known it for longer than you'd like to admit. And I think the only thing that's kept you from opening it is that you've built your whole life in front of it. Your career, your identity, your reputation, it's all stacked up against that door, and walking through it means losing what's stacked there. That's not a small thing. I'm not saying it is, but I don't think you called me tonight because you think it isn't true." I drove to my daughter's house that weekend. I hadn't told her I was coming. I drove the 2 hours on a Saturday morning with the windows cracked slightly, even though it was still cold, the spring air coming in sharp and smelling of wet earth, and I knocked on her door and she opened it and looked at me with that careful distance I knew so well, that self-protective look that was my own face rearranged into something more guarded, and I said, "Caitlin, I think I owe you something I don't know how to give yet, but I'm trying to figure it out." She looked at me for a long moment. She didn't say anything at first, and then she stepped back and let me in, and the smell of her house, coffee and something baking, cinnamon maybe, and the plastic and fabric smell of her daughter's toys scattered across the living room floor, hit me like something I had been away from for a very long time, something warm and specific and real. The change didn't come all at once. I want to be honest about that because I think the way conversion is sometimes described makes it sound like a lightning bolt, a moment of blinding clarity, an instantaneous reorientation of everything. For me, it was not a lightning bolt. It was more like a long thaw after a long winter, gradual and not always comfortable, the ground shifting and softening in ways that could feel like instability before they felt like release. It was reading and praying. And yes, I began to pray. Tentatively, clumsily, feeling vaguely absurd, the way you feel when you try to speak a language in a country where you're just arriving, not at all sure the words mean what you think they mean, not at all sure anyone is listening. I sat in my armchair at night with a cold cup of tea beside me and my hands loosely folded in my lap, and I talked, out loud sometimes, to whoever might be there, with the specific awkwardness of a man who has spent 30 years publicly mocking the very thing he was now attempting. I did not feel anything dramatic. I felt mostly like a person talking to themselves in a quiet house, but I kept doing it anyway, and that decision to keep doing it anyway, I understand now, was itself a form of faith. It was driving to a church one Sunday morning, a small one, not James Calloway's church because that was 6 hours away, but a small church near my house that I had driven past for years, a modest brick building with a marquee sign out front that said things I had always found either banal or irritating. And sitting in the back row with my coat still on, ready to leave at any moment, positioned near the aisle like a man who needs to know the exit is available, and listening to a man preach about a father who sees his son coming from a long way off and runs to meet him. Not walks, runs down the road, his robe gathered up in his hands, undignified and urgent, before the son has a chance to deliver the speech he's rehearsed. And something in that image, not the theological apparatus around it, not the sermon's argument, just the image of a father running towards someone who has been away, undid something in me that I don't think I had words for then and barely have words for now. I sat in that back pew with my coat on, and I felt something moving in me like water moving under ice, slow and unstoppable. I didn't cry in the church. I cried in the parking lot afterward, sitting in my car for the second time in my life with the engine running and nowhere to go, except this time I knew what I was feeling. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my mother's funeral, the kind of crying that doesn't feel like sadness exactly, that feels like something enormous releasing, like pressure. You didn't know you were carrying finally finding somewhere to go. My hands were shaking slightly on the steering wheel, and the morning sun was coming through the windshield at an angle that made everything look washed in something warm, and I sat there and let it happen without trying to understand it, which was perhaps the most significant departure from my prior self that I had yet managed. I called James Calloway that afternoon, and I told him what had happened. I said, "I think I believe." And he laughed, warm and genuine, and he said, "Thomas, I think you've believed for longer than you're giving yourself credit for. I think the belief has been there waiting for the man to catch up with it." And maybe he was right. Maybe the door had been there for longer than I admitted. Maybe the draft had been blowing under it for decades, and what I had spent 30 years calling rational inquiry was actually something else. Something I needed a word for that was more honest than rationality. A very elaborate, very well constructed, very extensively published way of standing with my back against a door I was terrified to turn around and face. Following Jesus, and I want to be precise here because precision still mattered to me and still does. Following Jesus is not the same as following a religion, and that distinction took me time to understand, and I still understand it imperfectly. The Christianity I had spent my career dismantling was largely institutional, structural, systemic, and those critiques, many of them I still find valid. Human institutions built around sacred things tend to accumulate all the pathologies of human institutions: power, corruption, exclusion, the grinding machinery of who belongs and who doesn't and who gets to decide. I had seen that. I had documented it. I had made arguments about it that I still believe were largely accurate. I was not wrong about the machinery, but Jesus himself, Jesus as he appears in the Gospels, which I read and reread that year, with the same methodological rigor I had applied to everything else in my career, with marginalia and cross-references, and the habits of a man trained to read primary sources carefully. Jesus was something I had not honestly reckoned with. Not the Jesus of institutional religion, not the Jesus who had been painted onto cathedral ceilings and drafted into the service of empires and political movements across 2,000 years of complicated history. The actual figure in those texts, the man who touched lepers when everyone else maintained their careful distance, who sat down to eat with people whose names no respectable person would want associated with theirs, who said things so strange and so radical and so precisely aimed at the places where human beings are most defended, that 2 millennia of interpretation have not been enough to fully domesticate them. This Jesus was not the crutch I had described in my books. He was not the comforting fiction I had analyzed in my lectures. He was something that demanded a response, and the response could not be intellectual neutrality. There was no neutral ground available when you actually read what he said. You had to do something with it. The professional consequences were significant, and I won't pretend they weren't. And I won't minimize them by rushing past them, because I think the people who have paid a price for following Jesus deserve to have that price acknowledged plainly. When word spread, and it spread faster than I expected, because academia is a small world and unusual things travel quickly through small worlds, the reaction from colleagues ranged from disbelief to genuine distress to something that looked very much like anger, and may have been something closer to betrayal. A man I had considered a close friend for 15 years, a man whose children I had watched grow up, stopped returning my calls. He never explained. He simply withdrew, and the withdrawal was absolute. A graduate student I had been mentoring, a brilliant young woman whose dissertation I had been shaping for 2 years, asked to be transferred to another advisor. I was not fired. I had tenure, and the university was committed enough to its own principles to protect that, and I am grateful for that protection even as I recognize its limits. But I was, quietly, gradually shifted to the margins of the department I had helped build. Invitations to conferences stopped arriving. The warm greeting in the hallway became a nod, and then the nod became a brief acknowledgement, and then sometimes just the particular busy focus that tells you someone has decided not to see you. I had spent 30 years in a world where I was known and respected and belonged, and I had walked out of it, and the door had closed behind me with more finality than I had fully anticipated. I want to tell you that this didn't hurt. I want to tell you that the peace of following Christ made the loss of that world feel small, made it easy, made it clean. But that would not be fully honest, and honesty is something I owe you and owe myself, and have come to understand I owe to Jesus, who did not, as far as I can tell, ever promise his followers that things would be easy. It hurt. It hurt in the specific grinding daily way that losing a community hurts, the way losing the version of yourself that other people respected hurts, the way waking up and not knowing exactly who you are anymore hurts. There were mornings when I woke up in my quiet house and felt the absence of that world the way you feel the absence of a limb that isn't there anymore. A phantom weight, a phantom warmth, the specific ache of reaching for something that used to be there. And I had to choose, on those mornings, to get up anyway. To sit at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in the mug, and my open Bible and my clumsy, imperfect, fumbling morning prayers, and to choose again the thing I had chosen, in the ordinary, unremarkable light of an ordinary, unremarkable morning, when it didn't feel luminous at all. I had to learn that faith is not primarily a feeling, it is primarily a choice, made again and again, in the mornings when the feeling isn't there. Caitlin was the unexpected grace in all of this. I had not expected my daughter to be moved by what was happening to me, and I was careful not to press her, conscious of having already shaped her life in one direction without her full consent. But she watched the change in me with the careful attention of someone who has been waiting for a long time to see something real in a person they love, something that wasn't performance or argument. She had been raised without faith, which was my doing, and she had never seemed to miss it. But she started asking questions, quietly at first, and then more directly her father's daughter in the precision of her asking, and one Sunday morning, about 8 months after my own first visit to that small church, she called me and asked if she could come with me, and I said yes, and we sat together in the 3rd row. She had, over several visits, gently moved me out of the back row, and I watched my daughter listen to something that I had robbed her of for her entire childhood. I felt simultaneously grateful and grieved, which is an emotion I do not have a single clean word for, but which I have come to understand is part of what the Christian tradition means when it speaks of repentance. Not just sorrow for the past, but the specific ache of seeing what could have been and choosing to be grateful for what still is. The forgiveness I needed to receive was not only from God, though it began there. I needed to be forgiven by people I had genuinely hurt. And sitting with that honestly, without the cushion of rationalization, was among the most difficult things I have ever done. Students whose faith I had systematically dismantled, not because they needed it dismantled, but because I needed an audience for my certainty. Colleagues I had made feel small in seminars and public settings with the casual precision of someone who didn't have to work hard to win. My ex-wife Ellen, whom I called one evening and spoke with for a long time, haltingly, working through what I wanted to say with none of the fluency I had in front of an audience, and who listened without interrupting, and who said, finally, in her measured and generous way, "Thomas, I'm glad you're not alone anymore. That's what I always wanted for you. That's what I was never able to give you." And the grace in those words, the kindness in them, the complete absence of bitterness from a woman who had every right to bitterness was almost unbearable. Almost. I held it as carefully as you hold something fragile, and I said thank you, and I meant it in more directions than I could name. James Calloway drove up from Kentucky 4 months after I called him to tell him I believed. He drove 7 hours, arriving on a Saturday morning in October when the trees along my street were turning, the maples bright red against a grey sky, and he sat in my living room, which he noted with a smile had an impressive number of books and a suspicious lack of anything on the walls. And we talked for most of that day. He answered my questions with patience and without condescension, working through my objections not as though they were obstacles to be cleared, but as though they were real and worth taking seriously, which is the rarest kind of theological interlocutor. Before he left, as the light outside was going thin and golden, he prayed for me. He stood in my living room and put a hand on my shoulder. The warmth of it through my shirt, a simple human touch. And he prayed out loud, in the simple, unadorned language of someone talking to a person they know well and trust completely. No performance, no theology on display. Just a man talking to Jesus about another man who was finding his way. And I stood in my own living room with my eyes closed and felt something I can only describe as the sensation of not being the last thing between myself and the dark anymore, of there being something solid behind me at my back. Something that had been there, I was beginning to understand. And this understanding was the most disorienting and the most beautiful thing that had happened to me for a very long time. The teaching changed. I still taught philosophy. I still taught the history of religious thought, which remained my field even if my relationship to it had undergone a revision so fundamental that some days it felt like learning to walk again. But I taught it differently. Where I had taught with the satisfaction of someone taking apart a machine to show how the parts worked, I began to teach with something closer to genuine wonder at the questions themselves. The questions that had once been weapons became slowly, genuinely interesting to me again, not as targets but as invitations. Students noticed. Some were unsettled by it, particularly the ones who had taken my courses because they wanted the version of me that confirmed their own atheism. A few came to my office hours not to discuss their papers but to talk, in the uncertain way of young people working through the biggest questions about what they actually believed and why, and whether belief was something they were allowed to take seriously. Those conversations became, without my planning or intending them, some of the most alive hours of my professional life. I was baptized on a Sunday morning in April, 2 years after the debate. The church had a baptismal pool in a back room, small and slightly cold to the touch when I tested it with my hand beforehand, the water smelling faintly of chlorine. The pastor who baptized me was a man named Robert, a former electrician who had come to faith in his 40s after his own long and complicated journey, and who spoke about Jesus with the directness of someone for whom faith had cost something and therefore meant something. He stood beside me in the water, which came up just above our waists, cold enough to feel real and present, and he asked me whether I believed that Jesus Christ is Lord. Not was, is, and I said yes. Not as a debate position, not as a hypothesis I was prepared to revise pending further evidence, as the truest thing I had ever said out loud, as the thing underneath all the other things. Caitlin was in the front row. She was crying in a way that looked like something being released after a long compression, and her daughter, my granddaughter, 3 years old, utterly unconcerned with the theological weight of the moment, was pulling at her sleeve and asking something about the water, and I thought of my mother kneeling beside her bed in the early morning quiet, lips moving soundlessly, face arranged in peace, and I understood. Standing waist-deep in cold chlorinated water in a small Ohio church with my daughter weeping in the front row, what my mother had been doing in those mornings. She hadn't been coping. She hadn't been managing anxiety or fear of death or the need for a framework. She had been in relationship with someone real. She had been known, and she had wanted that for me for decades, with a patience and a faithfulness that I now understood were themselves a kind of grace. And 30 years after I had decided that there was nothing on the other side of that door, I was saying out loud that I had been wrong, and the relief of it, the sheer, extraordinary, bodily relief of being wrong about the thing I had most needed to be wrong about, was the most remarkable thing I had ever felt. Not the most dramatic, the most remarkable, the most true. I have been a follower of Jesus for 3 years now. I say that with the same commitment to precision I once applied to everything. 3 years is not long. I am a new and imperfect Christian, clumsy in my faith, still too proud, still too quick to lead with analysis when what a moment calls for is presence, still too slow to let people see the things I find difficult. There are things about the church that frustrate me because institutions are still institutions, and I was right about the machinery. I was right that human systems built around holy things tend to accumulate human failures. But I have had to learn, slowly and with help, the difference between the machinery and the thing the machinery was built to carry. The institution is imperfect, Jesus is not, and the willingness to stay in proximity to the imperfect institution because of what it carries, imperfectly in the direction of the people who need it. That willingness is itself, I think, something I am learning from Jesus. There are questions I haven't resolved and may never resolve in this lifetime, and I have had to make peace, incrementally and imperfectly, with that. The man I was would have found that intolerable. The man I am is learning to understand that certainty was never the destination. The destination is relationship. The point, as best I understand it now, and I understand it better some days than others, more clearly in the mornings than in the midnights, more fully in community than alone, is not to win the argument. It is to be in relationship with the one who, as far as I can understand anything, made all arguments possible, to be known, to be, and here I use the word I spent 30 years treating as a symptom of psychological weakness, loved. I think about that auditorium, the creaking wooden seats, the lights that were slightly too bright, the smell of chalk dust and cold coffee, and the particular charged air of 400 people waiting to see something they could not yet predict. And James Calloway, a pastor from rural Kentucky with a worn Bible and no published papers in peer-reviewed journals, looking directly at me and asking me what I was afraid of finding. I think about that fraction of a second when the response didn't come. I have a different understanding of that fraction now. I believe, as fully as I believe anything, that in that fraction of a second, what I actually experienced was Jesus. Not the Jesus of my imagination or my critique or my decades of careful, thorough, well-remunerated dismissal. Not the Jesus of institutional religion or political movements or the long and frequently terrible history of what human beings do with holy things. The actual Jesus, standing in the gap between my question and my answer, patient as he has apparently always been, having apparently always been there, waiting for me to stop talking long enough to hear something that had been being said to me for a very long time. I was afraid of finding that I had been wrong. I was afraid of finding that the silence I had spent decades insisting was just the universe's indifference was actually something else, something that had been waiting and present and patient throughout. I was afraid of finding that what my mother's lips were moving toward in the early morning quiet of a western Pennsylvania house 30 years ago was real. And it turns out, and the turned outness of it still sometimes stops me in the middle of an ordinary day, that everything I was afraid of finding was true. If you're still with me, if this story has reached something in you that you've been carrying quietly or not so quietly, I want you to know that this channel exists for exactly this reason. For stories like this one and for the ones we haven't heard yet, real people, real struggles, real encounters with a Jesus who does not wait for us to have everything figured out before he starts moving toward us. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. And if you know someone who is standing in front of a door they're afraid to turn around and face, share this with them, not because I have anything to offer, because he does. We are just getting started here, and I believe with everything I have that the testimony that matters most to someone watching right now might be the next one we share.